Hey there, positive managers. Welcome to Module 3, where we'll take a deeper dive into employee attitude. And as with most modules, you can find information on this topic in my Manager Toolkit, where you can follow along. I'm certain you've described one or more of your employees as having an attitude, whether good or bad. We all have an attitude problem at times. When I worked in HR, it was common for managers to come in and say, "I've got this problem with one of my employees. They have a bad attitude, and I don't know how to help them change it. What do I do?" And that question is sincere, but it's misguided. So when a manager would come to me with their employee attitude problem, I'd ask them, "What's your employee doing that leads you to infer that they have a bad attitude? In other words, how can you tell?" It's important for you to understand that attitude, by definition, is a way of thinking or feeling that's reflected in behavior. And in order to communicate to an employee that what they're doing is unacceptable and has to change, you must be able to describe the unacceptable actions you're observing. It's those actions that are communicating to you that the employee is feeling something negative, or at least not constructive to the workplace. The most effective managers learn how to discuss employee performance in behavioral terms, rather than mentioning attitudes at all. Here are examples of various attitudes, both negative and positive, versus what it looks like as a behavior. Enthusiastic could translate into completing work ahead of schedule. Neglectful could translate into violating company policy. Laziness could translate into arriving to meetings late or unprepared. A person who's difficult to get along with could translate into a person who has a problem shouting at coworkers. Someone who shows initiative could translate into that they regularly complete requests before they're due. A service-oriented person would answer the phone within 3 rings every time. And a messy person could have trouble locating files when needed. So what does this sound like in a feedback conversation? In a conversation with an employee who has a quote-unquote bad attitude about changes to a new system, you may feel like starting the discussion, "You were really hard to get along with during that meeting. I don't appreciate the way you talked to me or the team." Unfortunately, this approach focuses on what you think the employee's attitude is, and it immediately puts that employee on the defensive. Instead, try starting the conversation by stating the behaviors you observed. It might sound like this: "I've noticed that you raised your voice during the meeting when we were talking about the system conversion. Since this conversation began with a behavioral observation, you leave room for the employee to respond without feeling quite as defensive." Often, managers will have a conversation with an employee without preparing ahead of time. But in those cases, the discussion often becomes a blame game or loses focus. By preparing ahead of time and focusing on behaviors, you increase the odds that the conversation will stay productive. When dealing with attitude, there are 4 steps. Focus on behavior, describe the impact of the behavior on you, the team, or customers, create a clear set of expectations, and task the employee with building a plan for improvement. Let's look at each one more closely. First, focus on behaviors. Share with the other person your observations about the behaviors that are concerning you, and don't make judgments. This keeps the employee more open and less defensive. Second, describe the impact of the behaviors. There's a problem or problems caused by that bad attitude. Once you frame it in terms of behavior, you can then go on to describe how that behavior is negatively impacting others. Clearly let the employee know how their behavior is impacting the work, the results, their success, and their relationships. Third, create a clear set of behavioral expectations. You need to create a clear picture of success for that employee by describing what that successful behavior looks like. And take the opportunity to review your expectations work in your blueprints to be sure you're describing them in terms of behaviors and not attitudes, now that you're clear on the difference and why it's important. Once you do that, Spell out how those new behaviors will change the employee's results. And the more you involve the employee in visualizing success, the more responsibility they'll take for owning the new outcome. After all, it is their behavior. Finally, the most important step is to assign the employee the task of coming back to you with their own plan for improvement. There's a gap between where they are now and where you want them to be, and they need to figure out how to close that gap. All the rest is of little value if there isn't a plan for changing their behavior. By tasking them with coming back to you with a plan, they're more deeply invested in its ownership, and you, as their manager, can then let them know how you'll encourage and support that plan's success. Make sure to set a time to follow up on progress or lack of it. And most importantly, for success, make sure you praise the very first time you see any little change toward the successful new behavior. I've now laid the groundwork for you to take these new skills, abilities, and viewpoints and apply them both in your annual review process, but more importantly, in weekly one-on-ones. But what about dealing with your employees' emotional reactions to all of your new skills and viewpoints? We're going to address that next.